It's actually whether we have access to the bank of mum and dad, which is shaping our future and our opportunities as a generation.
So that's a class indicator now, the bank of mum and dad.
Absolutely. The opportunities our parents had are not available for us. If we think about what has become so expensive, it's not just house buying, it's also renting. It's not just education, it's also childcare. And one may say that like the main entry points to adulthood have become unobtainable for our generation.
Eliza, welcome to PoliticsJOE.
Great to be here.
How would you like to introduce yourself?
So I'm Dr Eliza Filby. I'm a generations historian, and I kind of study and research and write and talk about how different generations are changing and evolving and what it means for us all.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how Gen Z and the millennials, or the bottom end of millennials, are going to be different to every other generation? I know that's something that you've worked on for quite some time.
So I think there's a real generational difference between obviously millennials and Gen Z, right? Millennials are now no longer young. They grew up in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis when wages stalled and certain things became more and more expensive. Education, obviously, housing, both renting and buying. What became cheap as they entered adulthood? Eating out. Technology, hence the origins of that awful narrative of like, you know, smartphone obsessives that eat too much avocado on toast and can't afford houses. The economics were pushing in that direction for that older millennial demographic. But I think that sort of cohort that was born sort of around 1995 right through to, say, around 2005, there's what I call the bridging generation, those older millennials and younger Gen Z, and they maybe didn't grow up realising it, but they grew up in the shadow of the financial crisis. So it maybe didn't directly affect them, but it affected their parents. They obviously grew up with not just a smartphone, but social media. So the average Gen Zer, an older millennial, has had a smartphone in their pocket since they were 13. So that kind of not just growing up with a smartphone, but growing up on social media. And what happens, I think, and what's distinct about that generation as opposed to millennials is they've grown up with the world's information in their pocket. So they're really, really cynical and they're very distrusting. And they've also grown up with the world's marketplace in their pocket in the context of a recession. And that means they're very entrepreneurial, very savvy, and don't believe in one wage alone. And I think there's a real division between those older millennials that grew up thinking, I want to grow up doing what I love and buying a house. Whereas the younger millennials and the older Gen Z are going, we grew up in chaos, we need to rewrite the rules because the old rules didn't serve the generation before us. So I think there's a kind of savviness and entrepreneurial spirit, a cynicism to that younger, that older Gen Z and younger millennial cohort for sure. And obviously, of course, COVID massively shaped their attitudes towards work and work-life balance.
And the generation that is used to hearing no, the generation who haven't been used to stability, does that affect how they are financially?
I think is like becoming clear when it comes to financial health is that the idea of a job for life went with our parents. The idea of a career for life is no longer true either. So it's been estimated that Gen Z will have over 15 different employers over the course of their working life and 5 different careers. And so fluidity, we use that word a lot in terms of gender. I think we need to start talking about it in terms of our careers and that idea of not only because of personal self-improvement and fulfillment, we want to do different things in our lives, but also because of AI, right? That generation are going to be most exposed to AI and going to have to constantly upskill and outskill AI. And the real question is who's going to pay for that? Who's that going to really benefit? And how do they remain agile in order to do that in the workplace? And so it's no wonder that generation are going, you know, I'm not going to be a sort of like slavish to the corporate career ladder because it doesn't serve me in the way that I want it to, and frankly doesn't serve even those that, I'm going to start that again, sorry. There's a reason why that generation aren't sort of slavishly sort of dutiful and deferential to the corporate career as traditionally set, because it's not serving that generation in the way that did it their parents.
Does it make them lazy?
No, young people have been dismissed as lazy, entitled and unwilling to work hard, like literally throughout history. You can go right back to the 14th century, like 4th century, and find references.
Even further back.
4th century, and find references to young people being dismissed as, you know, entitled and lazy. I think once you hit 35, you realise you're no longer young. I'm saying 35 is the cutoff, by the way. And you start to kind of realise, and this is happening to millennials, of course, engaging with Gen Z in the workplace, that they're different, they like different things, they have different attitudes, they use different tech, they're on different platforms. And I think there's a perception growing amongst millennial managers that they're not doing what we did when we were their age. And I think that there's a whole bracketing of Gen Z as lazy, but actually what they are really good at is multitasking and actually setting in clearer boundaries around work and tech, which millennials are really bad at doing.
But the two generations are somewhat united under this inheritance economy that you've been speaking about in this book, that your entire book is about. Can you explain that concept?
So, yes. It came from my own story, really. So I was someone who thought they worked really hard, passed all the exams, got to university, and not only got a BA, but then did an MA and then did a PhD. And I was really one of those people that believed in the meritocracy, that hard work got you wherever you wanted it to. And I was that older generation of millennials who were like told, let's get as many of you to university, and that pathway into professional, stable, middle-class life will be there. And frankly, that promise has been found wanting. Like, it hasn't materialised in the way that we thought it would. And I realised that I may have been the first person in my family to get a degree. I may have been raised in a working class household, which I was. My great aunt was a pearly queen. We were working class, like that's how I culturally identified. But I realised actually the most important part of my story was not my education, but the fact that my parents owned 3 properties in South London. And I had a crash pad to stay, rent-free throughout my 20s in London. And so I was gradually sort of realising that I was becoming those people I hate, which is like, I'm working class, I'm really working class. And actually I wasn't. And I wasn't, not because of my education. I wasn't because my parents had provided the safety net for me in my 20s, and frankly, the springboard in my 30s. And that was actually not just my story, it was becoming the story not just of my friends, but of an entire generation. And the more I dug into this, the more I realised that we weren't living in a meritocracy, we were living in an inheritocracy. And that idea is not just the bank of mum and dad being the 6th largest mortgage lender in the UK and helping us on the property ladder if we have it. It's support with education, because the upfront costs are very much dependent on your parents' willingness or capacity to pay for that. It's influencing childcare and even the next generation's university fees. And so the bank of grandma and granddad impacting Gen Z and Gen Alpha is really having a huge impact on whether you can afford childcare, whether you can afford to your grandparents are supporting their grandkids through university. And I suddenly began to realise this was an element of privilege, financial privilege, that was impacting huge swathes of the economy and dividing our generation. And I realised that it wasn't what we earn anymore, because wages have stalled since the financial crisis. It wasn't what we were learning anymore, because the value of the degree has gone down as the cost of that degree went up. It's actually whether we have access to the bank of mum and dad, which is shaping our future and our opportunities as a generation.
So that's a class indicator now, the bank of mum and dad.
Absolutely. And I think it's weird because, you know, inheritance has always been there, right? And it's, in that sense, I'm not saying anything new, but its importance of determining one's class has never been greater. For example, as I said to you, I'm the first person in my family to get a degree. But actually, that's not the most important thing that defines my class. The fact is that my parents were multiple homeowners in London. And you know, in that sense, you think, oh, well, you're middle class. Obviously, you're middle class. But no, because my grandfather won a house in a bet. So that was home ownership by luck. And then my mum, he was a compulsive gambler. He used to bet a lot, and he won deeds to a house in a bet. So
it's like something out of an Austen novel.
I know it was. But in a way, like, we were homeowners like through luck. But then what another layer of luck was that my parents in the 1980s bought the first house, a 5-bedroom house in Tooting Broadway for £28,000. Now, it had no floors, it had no ceilings, it was a total wreck. My mum at that time got a support fund from the local council to help do it up. You know, home ownership was in an age of, you know, Thatcher selling off council houses. It was an age where that generation was benefiting from that massive expansion in home ownership. So in that sense, yes, I was very lucky that my grandfather had won the deeds to the house, but also put them in my grandmother's name so he couldn't bet them again. But actually, we also need to appreciate the amount of fortune that my parents' generation had buying up houses in the 1980s. And so that's more important, defining my class, than any education that I got. And frankly, any profession I went into. I was an academic for 8 years and I was earning around £12,000 a year. It's a middle class profession with a really poor wages, particularly if you're at the lower rungs of the ladder. And that wasn't determining my class. My education, I had a PhD. That was not determining my class. It was the fact that I had basically a crash pad in my 20s and the bank of mum and dad that was the safety net and the springboard. That was the definer of my class. And I think in the book, what I try to do is explain the way in which there are people who have great education, went to Oxbridge, but don't have the bank of mum and dad and are struggling. There are people that had no education, but whose parents are multiple home owners and they are classically middle class and have that safety net. So I think it's upended classical definitions of what middle class, professional middle class, working class and upper class are.
But going back to that crash pad, when you're talking about accessibility, so it was more accessible for your parents' generation to enter onto the property ladder than it is now for generations. So, I mean, that property was bought for, I think it was around £20,000, wasn't it? And you got the £5,000 council grant. That house, if you don't mind me saying, is now probably could go on the market for around £1 million.
Yeah.
That sort of barrier to entry, how is that affecting the younger generations?
So that's the story of the book, essentially, is that the opportunities our parents had are not available for us. And if we think about what has become so expensive, it's not just house buying, it's also renting. It's not just education, it's also childcare. And one may say that like the main entry points to adulthood have become unobtainable for our generation. We're generation becoming known as kidults, right? We're stunted in our growth. We're failing to launch. We're not doing the traditional pathway into adulthood.
Well, can you explain that concept of the kidults? How do you define that?
So it's something that I talk about in the book. It's that idea of we are not sort of taking the traditional pathway into adulthood that our parents did. And there's sort of 5 markers of adulthood, if you like. There's finishing your education, there's leaving home, there's getting married, having a kid, and being financially independent of your parents. And on all 5 of those markers, we've either delayed them or frankly rejected them. So fewer of us are getting married, fewer of us are having children. You know, we're extending our education, we're extending our stay with our parents, and we're financially dependent on them more and more. And so I sort of talk about this concept of kidulthood because it's that idea of we're not quite adults because economically we're struggling to do those traditional adulting things, but we're not, kids. So it's this point in our lives between, I sort of frame it around 18 to 35, where there is a culture of dependency on our parents if we have it. And if we don't have it, we're also unable to launch into adulthood as well. And that's, I trace the story back to the 80s because that's when our parents' story started. That's when they were able to amass such wealth, particularly in property. They had conditions that we don't have. Good pensions, good wages, access to property. They've built an incredible amount of wealth. 1 in 5 baby boomers is a millionaire in this country. But the point is that the real story of the inheritocracy starts in 2008 because it's when wages stall, it's when house buying and renting goes up, it's when the kind of chief markers of adulthood become ever more expensive. And the market becomes dysfunctional, as we know, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, particularly around housing. The state retracts, so the state isn't there to help. So who steps up and who steps in to help those that, their loved ones? It's the parents. And so the Bank of Mum and Dad, even as a phrase, kind of comes into the sort of public domain around 2014. And really it's something that we've used as a sort of shorthand to describe the dependency culture that a lot of us have on our parents in a way that we don't rely on the state or the market. And that's a dysfunctional economy, right? It's creating a dependency culture that's preventing people from relying on their wages. It's preventing people from getting on the housing ladder. It's in many cases preventing people from having more than one child or any children. And so it's actually a really dangerous economic force. But it's also one built on love rather than cold, hard capitalism.
But it's also one that the Conservative government, I mean, we don't know if Labour are going to do this as well, but we're actually quite happy to rely on. There was sort of it was quite well known in government that a lot of people would need to rely on their Bank of Mum and Dad, but even lenders as well. Because if you look at some of the, I know that Nationwide put up a 6 times loan to value mortgage offer the other day, and that is to attract people who simply cannot rely on the Bank of Mum and Dad. So where does this leave us all financially? If you don't have access to the Bank of Mum and Dad, where are you?
Exactly. And first of all, it's really important to classify that it's not a 1% issue. It's not just the 1% that have the Bank of Mum and Dad. It's not just the 10% that have the Bank of Mum and Dad. The Bank of Mum and Dad doesn't just come in the form of a house deposit. It can come in form of childcare support, for example, in terms of time. It can come in terms of staying with your mum and dad while you save for a deposit. And it's not just a London problem either. I very distinctly sort of literally toured the country interviewing different people from across the UK, sort of really doing a deep dive as to the regional levels of dependency on the Bank of Mum and Dad. And it's very clear that over 80% of millennials expect to get some kind of inheritance. 80%. Now, that's reflective of the fact that there's so much wealth in that older demographic, okay? So there's about 5.5 trillion amount in housing, £1 trillion in housing, and quite a substantial amount in pensions. Now, the lucky ones, the really fortunate ones, are the ones that get their inheritance early, that get a lump sum to buy a house, right? And get it when they're ready as well, okay? So they're the lucky few. And then the really lucky ones are the ones that marry someone who also has a Bank of Mum and Dad, because then you're talking about the merging of two banks of mum and dads. The really unfortunate are the ones that have no parental support, obviously, whatsoever, who have no access to that safety net, let alone an early inheritance. But there's also those the really unfortunate as well, who don't get their inheritance early and will have to wait for it until their parents pass away. And that comes with great uncertainty, of course, because the conversation we don't have as a country is around social care. And the reason why I talk about social care in the book and looking after our parents is because if we've had 30 years of our parents looking after us and frankly supporting us, we've now got 30 years quite often, because we're living longer with illnesses, and dying is now actually a much more complex thing in the 21st century than it was in the 19th. We've now got to look after them. And that puts our inheritance, crudely speaking, at risk. And we have this funding gap in the social care system, as we know, but we also have a lot of money in property. And so I would say there is an unspoken sort of assumption that the baby boomers will have to pay for their own social care, mostly through their property wealth. Okay, the support system from the state funding for social care isn't there. Families won't be able to pay for it themselves. It's going to come from the release of property. So the really unfortunate, the ones that are waiting for an inheritance, expecting an inheritance, but it will be gobbled up by the social care bill of their parents. So I wanted to sort of map out this inheritocracy, because although it's often in reference to housing and perhaps education, because education has become more and more expensive, actually also kind of fits in with social care as well. And that's a young people's problem. People talk about social care like it's an older people's problem. It's not. In the way in which, whether we pay for it through our families or through the tax system, we're going to have to foot that bill. And so I wanted to kind of tease out this sort of economics of that and talk to people who've lost the family home, or who have sacrificed their inheritance, or who have even sacrificed their own wealth to pay for social care, to pay for nursing home or home care for their elderly parents with long-term illnesses.
Does that not sort of bring back the meritocracy if you're having to give up your family home to pay for your parents' care? Is that not sort of like mutual destruction?
Yes and no, because the ones that are really fortunate, as I say, have planned their inheritances out so that they avoid inheritance tax, okay? And only 4% of estates pay inheritance tax, only 4%, and are gifted their inheritances early. So I spoke to a financial advisor who was like, the ones who are being really savvy are dying poor, having gifted it all out as early as possible to their children.
Right.
And, there's the inequality there, which is the ones who are unable to financially plan and don't have that flexibility in their cash flow or their wealth are the ones that are really disadvantaged.
Right. So if they hoard wealth, they run into problems.
Yeah. Or if it's in property but unreleasable, that is a problem, because that estate, particularly if it's worth over £1 million, is liable to be subject to inheritance tax. So it's and also who knows what is happening and going to happen in the next budget. We have an inheritance tax system that is very avoidable. There are so many loopholes, whether you're putting your money into the AIM market, whether you're putting your money into your grandkids, whether you're putting money into agricultural land. There's loads of ways that you can reduce your estate and put it in places that mean that it's not subject to inheritance tax.
You can hide it.
And that's why only 4% of estates pay inheritance tax. And I suspect one of the things that the Treasury wants to do is close some of those loopholes. But I think the point is that we've seen such an amassing of wealth in the older generations, an economy that has been built on preserving that wealth. The Conservatives did prioritise wealth over wage, and wages were taxed in a way that wealth was not. And who does that advantage? Older, wealthy people with assets. And we have a growth in the value of those assets. And if that happens, of course, inevitably, inheritance takes on ever more importance. And that's essentially what's happened. And we have that social inequality that is not based, I would say, on wages. It's on that wealth, particularly amassed by those older generations. And also, frankly, the other element of this story that I haven't touched upon, but I think is really important, is that even the notion bank of mum and dad assumes that mum and dad are still together. And that in itself is a privilege that we don't kind of talk about enough, is that the passing down of wealth works well if the family is harmonious and conventional, right? But that's not the case. The biggest rise in divorces were around the 70s and 80s. So that generation is now coming through and are reaching their elder years and are passing that money down. So you've got not just, first marriage, possibly second marriage, blended families, step siblings, all of that. And that level of complication within the family unit actually also complicates the inheritance story. And I kind of talk to people from blended families and the way in which that can be just a cause of frustration, but also like a massive cause of just complication. Because if you've got step siblings who are at a different life stage to you, that need support with education, whereas you need support with housing from your parents, that in itself causes a clash of priorities across two different families. So I think that's kind of really, really sort of the element here. And that was part of the reason for writing it, is that this is a privilege that no one wants to talk about. No one wants to say, I actually got a deposit from my parents. Or no one wants to say, I don't have a student loan because my parents paid it. Or, grandma does all my childcare throughout the week. No one wants to talk about it. No one wants to talk about it within their peer group because, frankly, it puts a dent into this idea that we're self-made. No one wants to talk about it with their parents because we're economically infantilized by our parents, who frankly quite often have more wealth than we do. And no one wants to talk about it in society either, because the issue really forces us to confront, as I said, the cost of tertiary education and the rewards on that, the fact that that's declining, the cost of housing and how dysfunctional that market is and how it's propped up by the bank of mum and dad, and how financial institutions have basically coerced their services around that dynamic.
They've adapted to it.
They've adapted to it rather than confronted it. And it also sort of highlights the problem of social inequality and ultimately social care as well.
I thought what was interesting when you talk about, well, I suppose broadly, it's how your house stability, how Bank of Mum and Dad can essentially affect your life choices. And you talk about the type of men that you were dating. Yes. I just thought this was fascinating. You were saying that, at one point in your life you were dating artists and you were dating men who I suppose weren't, they weren't dependable men. And you could, because you had a base. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, I just had wonderful years of kidult sort of exploits and lack of responsibility, total dependence on my parents, by the way. And I had the freedom to not have to rely on a man and not have to think about really my future and not have to particularly date really nice people. I don't want to say that I'm a trad wife looking for a financially dependable man. I wanted to sort of understand how we grew up in a feminist society where women were told, you can do anything. You can be anything. You can do anything better than a man. And actually in the education system, we really did. We outperform men in the education system and still do. But what I realised is that of all the sort of women in my social group, and then I started looking at the data as well, that independence quite often came with a dependence on our parents, and not, as traditionally and historically women have done, depended on a man. And I realised that a lot of my relationships, I was the one who quite often was the breadwinner. I was the one that was financially solvent. I was the one that had the crash pad that they stayed in. And I was dating quite dysfunctional men who weren't really kind of getting to grips with responsibility at all in their 20s and even their 30s, really. And I was like, okay, there's an economic story here. It's not just that they're crap boyfriends, and they were quite crap boyfriends. It was that they were attracted to financially independent women, but I wasn't financially independent. I was dependent on my parents for my independence. And so I didn't have to kind of think about finances in my relationships with men. And I realised that all that claptrap about, find a man that loves you, find a man that values you, find a man that gets inside your head and, knows you better than anyone else, and all this kind of crap that we'd grown up with about model companionship and equality and all of that. I was like, no, there's a really clear economic story here happening amongst our generation of women, and an economic infantilization of men who don't have to step up in the traditional ways that they have had to be in that male breadwinner model. And I just wanted to kind of tell that story because it's something we don't admit and talk about. The importance of finances in relationships is the number one reason why marriages break down. And the way that unions now happen is really different from how it happened with our parents. So quite often, and crudely speaking, right, it's a generalization that the woman would transfer her financial dependence from her father to her husband. Yeah, that didn't happen in my family, by the way, but that's mostly how it used to take place. And I think with the millennial generation, particularly as our mothers were, feminists and wanted to sort of raise women to be sort of, independent beings in a much more independent world, were saying, you can do anything, but also be financially independent of a man. So I interview a woman in the book who has a joint bank account with her mother, but not her partner of 20 years. And I was like, that's fascinating. Why are you not aligning your finances with your partner, but you are with your mother? And she said, firstly, my mother has multiple rental properties and it just makes sense because we kind of order them together and we look after them together. And she said, secondly, I'm a product of divorce. And I've seen what happens when relationships go awry and the impact on one's finances. And she said, that's really shaped my attitude towards the financial dynamics within my relationship, and I want to be independent financially. And I don't want him to have ownership of anything that's mine when we break up. And that came out in the data, like really interesting. If you ask women, is an inheritance yours or a shared asset with your partner? Women said it's mine.
Right.
Whereas men, if you ask men, is an inheritance yours or a shared asset within a partnership? Men were more likely to say shared asset.
That's interesting, isn't it?
So I think I just wanted to, without sort of slagging off ex-boyfriends too much, just look at actually what was going on economically.
Well, no, I found it fascinating because I was thinking a lot of about the stories that came out after COVID when people were probably at their most financially insecure and they were staying in relationships because they were unable to leave properties because they had them with those partners. I thought that's so interesting that there are women who have to stay in unhappy relationships because they have got nowhere else to go. And this sounds like I'm sort of doing a blame culture thing here, and I'm not. But you were able to date freely because you had
but I dated
stability.
badly, that's for sure.
But that was your choice, right?
It was my choice, but I also think
I'm not saying that I haven't.
No, I know, but I think it's fascinating that I clearly attracted men that wanted a financially stable woman. And I wasn't that financially stable. But
so you're a trad husband, not trad wife.
I was totally trad husband. But I think also, like, my dad was a stay-at-home dad and my mum was the breadwinner, which was very avant-garde in the 1980s. And one of the things that I was thinking a lot about looking at my parents' story was that, in a way, it's just the gender rule book may have been ripped up in my family when I was growing up because it was sort of an inversion of the norm. But now it's really been, the gender rule book has been ripped up, and there's no rules as to, who's doing the caring, who's doing the earning, and that kind of thing. And that's sort of, I think, a really important thing we need to confront. It's great that men are changing more nappies than ever. That's great because women are earning more than ever. But it's also, if we've got a social care crisis, we're going to have to step up and look after our elderly in society. We need to get men to be changing as many catheters as nappies, and really performing the role of carers of the elderly as much as they found, a sense of masculinity in caring for their children, which millennial men, by the way, totally have.
So no more performative care.
Yeah. Well, I just think, caring for the elderly is so less sort of romantic and fun. I've done it. I've looked after my father before he died, and my mum lived with him for 2 years. It's very different from caring for children, and I think we need to confront that as young people, what that looks like and what impact that has on our jobs, our relationships, our living conditions and setups and all of that. It's a huge problem that no one's talking about.
Is there a solution to restructure the economic problems that you've laid out?
So I think the number one thing is awareness of all of this. I wish this book had been written 15 years ago, frankly, because it's the story of my life, and I feel like people reading it, and so the feedback has been thus far is that they feel like it's their life as well, that sense of like, what was the real underlying economic story here? And hopefully I've told that. So raising awareness about the dynamics, the family dynamics that are underscoring a lot of the economic shifts in society. So raising our awareness, so we're having an honest conversation. The second thing is we need to make inheritance matter less. That's what Paul Johnson of the IFS said. And I think it's a brilliant sort of quote because it's saying inheritance is not wrong. It's an overwhelming, the British public, by the way, are in favour of it. You should be able to pass your wealth down, but we should make it matter less. Mm-hmm. And that means taxing wealth more than wage. It means closing loopholes on inheritance tax. It means, freeing up the housing market. And that doesn't just mean building more houses. That might mean allowing, say, the 51% of baby boomers that live in bigger houses with 2 spare rooms, encouraging and incentivizing them to downsize if they so wish.
What, relieving stamp duty or what?
Yeah, yes, exactly. Enabling people to sell bigger homes that actually no longer suit their needs.
Right.
That's basically it. And whatever levers you can pull in the tax system, in the house buying
So making
system.
it financially enticing to sell your home.
Absolutely. And I think in that way, we overemphasize on building more houses, and yet there's lots of things we can do within the existing system to ensure that there's more fluidity within the existing stock that we've got.